Okay, welcome to another episode of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks. It is Saturday night, June 18th, 2016, and I'm coming to you again from the house that I grew up in Mundelein, Illinois. Tonight's episode is a special episode for the Father's Day weekend 2016. I'm here with my father, Brian Jacks. On this half-hour episode, I'm going to interview him to talk a little bit about his fandom over the last 50-plus years of being a Minnesota Twins and Chicago Cubs fan. So we're going to get into some of his favorite moments, players, managers, and teams in the history of the game. Also going to discuss his thoughts on the modern game as it is. And I'm also going to wrap things up by addressing last week's, or I guess it would have been a couple weeks ago, the podcast that we had up in Minneapolis on Memorial Day weekend, just to summarize that as well. So without further ado, go ahead and introduce my father, Brian Jacks. He's sitting here with me. My dad was born in November 1956 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he grew up all over the place, growing up in Virginia, Rhode Island, and Annapolis, Maryland. But he really started watching the game in the mid-'60s with the Minnesota Twins taking off and becoming one of the elite teams in the American League. So Dad, without further ado, let's go ahead and get going here. I'm going to start off by asking you what your earliest memory is of watching baseball growing up in Annapolis in the 60s.
Well, I would say my earliest memory would probably be when my grandfather came from Cokato, Minnesota, and drove to Annapolis, Maryland in the summer of '65 and brought a clip of the Minneapolis Star and Tribune, and it showed the Twins in first place. And I had never followed baseball before except just playing around as a kid. And basically from that moment on, I would say until about 1971, there wasn't a single day during the season when I didn't follow the Twins. So that was my earliest memory, and then of course we went to games at DC Stadium. I think the first game I went to was the night after the Twins in '65 clinched the American League pennant. And then what I remember was in October of '65, we were going to a farm in Pennsylvania. And my mother and father told me the Cliff family has a rule, no TV allowed. And I told my mother, I'm not going unless I can watch the World Series. So we got special permission to watch the '65 series on TV. And then the last thing I remember about that series was driving to pick up my father at Dulles Airport after he came back from Ethiopia and listening to Bob Allison strike out and end the game to Sandy Koufax.
Now, I know that in '65, not only did the Twins play host to the World Series, they also played host to the All-Star Game. Do you remember the '65 All-Star Game at all, and what do you remember about that in particular? And then, like you said, just kind of elaborating on your World Series experience that year.
I don't really remember the '65 All-Star Game. I remember the '66 game in St. Louis. Okay. That's the game that I really remember because it was so incredibly hot. I'm going to say that I probably didn't really start picking up baseball until after the All-Star break. I want to say my grandfather came maybe in late July. I know I've read about that lineup, the All-Star National League team from '65 probably was the best team in the history of baseball. But at that point, I didn't really start following All-Star games until the next year in St. Louis.
So just judging by history as it is, I'm guessing that '65 NL All-Star lineup had like Clemente, Mays, Aaron, Frank Robinson, some of those guys. Yeah. So you get beyond the '65 season, the Twins obviously losing 7 to the Dodgers. From there, the next really pinnacle year, I'm assuming for you, was '67 with that incredible 4 or 5 team pennant race. I already talked to Mom a little bit about that, her perspective as a White Sox fan. I just want to know your perspective as a Twins fan, watching the Twins come into Fenway in that last weekend of the season, and then the inevitability of Carl Yastrzemski basically ripping the hearts out of Twins fans there in that final game of the season. What your memory was of that 67 pennant race, and then the 67 World Series too.
Well, you're bringing up the worst weekend, one of the worst weekends of my sporting fan life. That's probably my first memory of my team not winning. The 65 series was hard to take, but I know that Sandy Koufax was pretty much unbeatable. But going into that weekend, I really felt like, since Conigliaro was out for the year when he got hit by that fastball from Jack Hamilton on August 18th, I felt like the Twins just need to win one out of those 2 games. And, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. So I was in 6th grade at West Annapolis Elementary, and I remember they had a fire hall right next door. And these were some really old, hard-bitten guys, typical Southern, kind of, I won't call them rednecks, but they were pretty rough guys. And I remember sort of gently asking them, do you mind if I listen to the game after and that's, of course, when the World Series started at 3 o'clock, and I was so honored that they would let me listen to that game. It was just an unbelievable series. There's so much talent. And just watching a World Series game in the afternoon when there were no night games, it was so much more fun. But yeah, that was just a breathtaking series. I was supposed to actually go to that game or go to that series. I met a woman in Nantucket who said she would provide us tickets, and then of course I found out that didn't happen. Yeah, but I want to also mention the 66 series, because when the Orioles played the Dodgers, they absolutely annihilated them, and that team was as close to a machine as any team I'd ever seen. But yeah, the 67 series was probably the first, I would say, really enjoyable World Series, because I liked the Cardinals. I always respected their talent.
I would have thought, being an American League guy all these years, I would have thought that you would root for the Red Sox in that series, but it was more about rooting for guys like Gibson and Curt Flood and Lou Brock. Those guys were more of your cup of coffee than the Red Sox at that time. Was that because they had beaten the Twins, or you just identify with that Cardinal team?
Well, I would say because of the Civil Rights era.
Oh, wow.
And my father worked for Robert Kennedy, and I followed Martin Luther King really closely.
Wow.
My school integrated the year before. My best friend was the one kid that integrated, Eddie Seacrest, in 66, and we were really close, and it was just an incredible experience. The Cardinals were really the first, other than the Green Bay Packers, really first integrated baseball team that I'd ever seen, truly integrated, and it was just so fun to watch them play. They had so much enthusiasm, and they were just a really fun team. They had great uniforms, and I just thought their style was appealing. The Red Sox were kind of dour and conservative and just sort of grim.
The men in gray flannel suits, huh?
Yeah.
Of the American League.
Yeah.
So basically the Cardinals, Packers, UCLA, basketball, the theme of integration in sports in the late 60s, that's what you're really identifying with at that time. Kind of going off of what you had said earlier about daytime World Series, and just to kind of pin these two together, if you could talk a little bit about, and I know for my generation this is really a foreign concept, the daytime World Series, and then 8 or 10 teams in each league, and only the pennant winner, the regular season champion, would get to the postseason. If you could talk about pre-division play and how intense that was, and as well, like you said, the enjoyment of watching those daytime World Series in the 60s and early 70s.
Well, there were a lot of things that went into it. First of all, when I was in, I guess it'd be 65, I was in 4th grade. And, when you're in elementary school, you when the day's over, you're going straight home, and normally there was just kind of boring shows like The Addams Family, or Three Stooges or Bonanza. That's all there was. And so all of a sudden you wait all year for these games. And it was so exciting. There was no build-up. There was no hype. There was no interleague play. It was before your parents got home, or certainly before my father got home, so therefore he didn't control the television. I could control the TV. And certainly my brother was younger than me, so he was going to do what I told him to. So that was part of it. What was the other thing you said?
I was asking about
something like 8 to...
Yeah, at that time in the 60s when there was only one team in the postseason from each team.
Yeah, I think that was better. I think that was better, too, because, in 68, everybody knew the Cardinals were just a dynamic team. Detroit, they kind of came out of nowhere. I remember every day or every week, my friend and I, Jackie Gorman, we would say, well, Denny McClain, he's got 7 wins now, he's got 10, and we would sort of have an informal bet about whether or not he could win 25 games, and all of a sudden he's winning 31 games, and Drysdale has his whatever it was, 55 innings, scoreless inning streak, and
the streak that Hershiser would eventually.
Yeah, I mean, just knowing that it took so much effort to make it to the World Series, and the other thing, of course, was that once the season was over, there was no 3-game series, 5-game series. When are we going to get through the first 2 rounds? You go right from the end of the season, right into the World Series. There's no interleague play. You've never seen this other team play. And then all of a sudden it's happening right now. And, that was fun. I wouldn't say that there were that many close, because I really follow the American League more. I wouldn't say there were a lot of close pennant races except 67. That was a crazy year because I remember we were in Nantucket and Dean Chance. We were at some a musical thing, outdoor little orchestra thing, and I kept telling my father, well, how many innings has he pitched? He's got a perfect game going. It's 4 innings, 5, 6, and I think after 7 it rained out or whatever. But I think it's in the books. Anyways, yeah, the build-up was really intense. Everything was on the line. You don't win the pennant, you go home. So, yes, going into that 67, and I know I read a book about it, The Last Great Pennant Race, there was unbelievable. The White Sox were involved in it. Of course, the Red Sox, the Twins.
Detroit had a great team.
Detroit. I just think, like I say, the lack of hype and just a natural build-up was a really exciting part of that time period.
And then another aspect of the game that certainly changed a lot now, it's a little bit more manufactured now with the way that they've emphasized it in terms of home field advantage in the World Series. But if you could, just a little bit for our listeners, talk about the importance of the All-Star Game in terms of the American League, National League rivalry that was certainly prevalent there in the late 60s. I know the game that you always talk about with me is the 68 All-Star Game at the Astrodome when Willie Mays scored the only run of the game in the first inning. So if you could just kind of talk about the importance of the All-Star Game at that time versus what it's become now.
Well, I would say starting in 66, going through probably 70 or 69, more than any other game, even the World Series, Super Bowl. Of course, Super Bowl didn't start until 67, but that was the one game more than any other game I look forward to, literally, in any sport. I remember I want to say 69, from the first day of the season in April up into that All-Star Game, there was nothing I was looking forward to more. When the game was on, I guarantee you, I was doing nothing else. And after those games were over, it was kind of a letdown. But the one I remember the most is actually 67, the one that went 15 innings in Anaheim when Tony Perez ended it. And it's just the breathtaking talent. Even up through the 70s. I remember watching an All-Star game in the Navy, and I want to say it was like 79.
Dave Parker?
Yeah, you look and all of a sudden you got Parker, you got Winfield, you got these huge, fast, big guys. And, of course, that's when I realized the National League was just dominant. But, yes, in the late 60s, the All-Star game, it was kind of like the NBA All-Star game or even the Pro Bowl. It was a badge of honor. You didn't want to look bad. And it was really, really important. And it was just so fun because, like I said, without the interleague play and with the playoff format, especially before 69, this was your only time really to see all the best players until the World Series.
Yeah, no, it's definitely changed quite a bit with the interleague stuff, and the game has certainly progressed or regressed in that form. But I know that it's definitely the postseason and the All-Star game, a lot of that stuff in terms of its the importance of one particular game or one particular series has certainly diminished to a certain respect in terms of just kind of with the expansion of both leagues, division play, wild card play, interleague play, like you said. I've always wanted to ask you this, and this is a great time to do it on air. I know we've had informal discussions for literally decades now. You've obviously watched 50-plus years of baseball. I know this is a tough question to ask you to put you on the spot, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. And I should have done this with Mom, too, and I certainly apologize to her as well. But if you could, go around the horn and give me your all-time lineup, 65 and on.
Yeah, that's fine, no problem. It has to be players that I've actually seen play.
You're going to go with guys that you've seen in person?
Well, no, either on TV or in person.
Okay, great.
So, yeah, that's not too hard. Obviously, catcher has to be Johnny Bench. And then I'll go with the pitcher. I would go, obviously, with Bob Gibson, Sandy Koufax, and then probably Dennis the Menace Eckersley. First base, I probably have Mex, Keith Hernandez. Second base, Joe Morgan. Shortstop, I would go with Ozzie Smith. Third base, I'd go with Mike Schmidt. Obviously, I would put Willie Mays in center, Roberto Clemente in right, and
would Barry Lamar Bonds be your?
Well, that's a tough one. Personally, I think the guy's a tool, and he did Jake it sometimes. No, I'm going to flip the switch. I'm going to go with Ricky Henderson.
Oh, that's a classic pick, yeah.
Yeah, and then for manager, one game, all the marbles, I'm going to go with Tom Kelly. Even though I know he's not in the Hall of Fame, he was a great manager for the Twins.
Yeah, I was going to ask you who your all-time manager was, because I know that we talked about Billy Martin briefly this evening before we sat down and did this podcast. I know that you got to see Earl Weaver manage in person, Joe Torre, another guy. So TK definitely, winning 2 World Series in Minnesota definitely had the impact. And your lineup had quite the National League flavor there, I noticed as well. So thank you for providing me with that. In general, over all these years, and you can go by decade with this, which would you say was your favorite era of baseball to watch?
Well, I would. That's a hard question.
You want me to give you Mom's answer first?
No. I'm going to say that, probably the mid to late 60s. And the reason I say this is because the Vikings were always an up and down team. And they were a franchise team in 61. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden in 67, Bud Grant comes along and becomes their coach, Harry Peter Grant from Superior, Wisconsin, University of Minnesota. When the Vikings started to get good in 68 and then especially 69, baseball for me was never the same. It became all about the Vikings for almost 20 years, except for when the Twins won the series in 87. So I would say those 5 years between 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, because there was nothing else holding my attention. I mean, when the Vikings were on TV, which was rarely because we were living in Maryland, the only game they seemed to ever play on national TV was against Lombardi, and those were always great games. Really low scoring, like 10-7. But beyond that, the Twins were the name of the game. There was no professional basketball in Minnesota. So even though I was living in Maryland, I was always a Minnesota kid. But the Twins in the mid to late 60s, watching Tony Oliva, I idolized that guy. I remember we were going to a game at DC Stadium, and the game was over, and the Twins were on the bus, and Killebrew walked right by me, didn't say a word. Tony Oliva in his broken English talked for almost 10 minutes, and then I saw Cesar Tovar going off in the night with some woman. He obviously wasn't on the bus, but that was the team for me, and that's when baseball was really fun. I was a kid. I read the newspaper, but no one was talking about drugs or strikes, and it was just a really fun time. Probably the most important thing is they weren't talking about contracts. There was no free agency, and it was just a great time to watch baseball.
Yeah, I would have loved to have seen a number of those guys play back then. I think that would have been a real treat to see, Willie Mays and Willie McCovey play for the Giants, or Stargell and Clemente play for the Pirates, and then the American League. You live right down the road from one of the greatest AL teams of all time, the Robinson boys and Earl Weaver's Baltimore Orioles. So you've seen a number of great teams over the years, but the late 60s, I already kind of knew that was going to be your answer, and I certainly expected that. But thank you for sharing that with the listeners as well. Kind of to shift gears a little bit here and go into a more humorous topic. I know I texted you Happy Lee Elia Day. I think it was back in late April when the anniversary, the 33rd, 34th year anniversary of that tirade. We joke around a lot about coach tirades in different sports. I know I talked about the Jim Mora one the other day with you. If you could give me your favorite managerial tirade of all time, whether that's Weaver or Lasorda or Billy Martin, whomever it is, could you name one tirade in your memory that sticks out as being particularly goofy, hilarious, crazy, or what have you?
Well, I was hoping you could broaden it out to all sports, because I would say Bobby Knight's tirade after losing to Purdue is probably the best thing I have ever heard. And I encourage your listeners to play it back. It's absolutely hilarious. But for baseball,
is it Hal McRae, stick it in your effing pipe?
No, probably the one it's not necessarily a tirade, but the Lou Piniella fight with Ron Dibble. Ron. Yeah. Rob, to be correct. It's probably the one where I've never seen a manager such a red ass. Lou Piniella was like the ultimate. It didn't matter. He still managed like a player. That was the craziest one I have ever seen, and I'm sure it's pretty tame. But it's not exactly the same thing, but I think my favorite manager moment has to be in the '84 World Series when Sparky tells Kirk Gibson he's going to pitch to you. And, of course, Gibson hits a monstrous home run. But
they don't want to walk.
Billy Martin, like Ben said, I saw him as third base coach with the Twins in the mid-'60s, and he was intense. But then I saw him at Howard Wong's restaurant in Bloomington, Minnesota one time when I was in the Navy in the late 70s. And he was the most mellow, peaceful guy. Yes, but managers are definitely different today. They're more by-the-book kind of guys, but I think they drank a lot in those days, and they were pretty fiery.
Yeah, needless to say, there have been a number of characters. It kind of started with Leo DeRocher and Casey Stengel and those guys, and it just built up from there in terms of the personalities. So now to go into, I would have to imagine, would be the two finest moments of your time as a baseball fan, 1987 and 1991 with the Twins. definitely wanted to talk about this with you because you have the unique experience of being an adult fan watching your hometown team win not one but 2 World Series. To quote LeBron James, not once, not twice, all that crap. If you could, just kind of go into talking about 87 in particular, because that was the first one, and we were still living up there when they won that. Obviously, I was a baby at that point in time. And if you could also talk about 91, too. I know that we were living down here, but you were still a Twins fan at that point. If you could talk about both those championship teams and what it meant to you to watch the Twins finally win a World Series after all those years. Win 2, actually.
Yeah, 87, I knew from the first game in the exhibition season that this was going to be a different team. When they brought in the Terminator, Jeff Reardon, that turned everything around. And they brought in the wrench,
Dan
Gladden. I mean, they brought some guys that were what I would call your classic red asses that were just willing to win absolutely at all costs. I think getting Reardon was the difference maker because all of a sudden now they had a pitcher that could finish a game. And it was really exciting to watch this team play. They were very fundamentally sound. They played hard every game. They didn't blow away the division. I think they only won 85 games. But mostly I remember a couple of things. One was Dan Barrero, who of course works for K-Fan now. After they had a game in early September, there was a play when Al Newman, the shortstop, instead of going to first, he went to home. And they said the reaction was instant. It was almost nuclear. All right. And all of a sudden, that team took off. And I remember when they beat the Tigers in the ALCS, Tom Ryther, who worked for Channel 5, said, I think something special is about to happen. And
in Minneapolis, that's ABC Channel 5, not NBC like us in Chicago.
They had a rally at the Metrodome. And Juan Berenguer, who I think they called El Gasolino, brought his briefcase out. They had this unbelievable rally. I was working downtown in Twin City Federal, and I went to my friend's house from McAllister to see Game 7. I remember my friend lifted me in the air. My head hit the ceiling when the Rat, Gary Gaetti, threw the ball to first, and the whole town just exploded. It was insane. It was such a good feeling. I remember seeing the parade. I shook Dan Schatzer's hand. My body was literally like glowing. I had just it was like literally my whole body was tingling. And then 91 was a little different. I did see that team play in Milwaukee County Stadium. And, they were just a good team. I watched Game 7 pretty much by myself. Like Ben said, he was really little at that point, and my wife was probably getting ready to go to work because that was a Sunday night game. I've never been more nervous in my life going into the 10th inning. And, when they won it on the sacrifice fly, it was a great feeling. I think I talked to my friend from McAllister, John Houck, for about half an hour. And then the reality of baseball intruded right after that when Jack Morris left and signed a contract with Toronto. So that's when I knew that baseball had changed.
Yeah, I mean, those are 2 incredible teams, 2 almost entirely different makeups as ball clubs. Mm-hmm. But I know that the 87 team, as you've said before, Dad, they were built primarily on fundamentals, executing the little things, playing really good defense and clutch hitting, where it seemed like that 91 team had a little bit more star power than the 87 team. So this will conclude the first segment of my interview for Father's Day weekend with my dad. We will be right back with a little bit of a conclusion on today's podcast with him talking about the game as is in the current era, and I will also discuss last podcast from Memorial Day weekend.
Are you looking for a great way to promote your business? Is your beer league softball team looking for more recognition? Do you need airtime to destroy your political rivals? Then contact the Ben Jacks Podcast, and this space could be yours for a fraction of the price of those greedy corporate podcasts.
Okay, and welcome back to part 2 of this Father's Day weekend special with my dad, Brian Jacks. This is your host, Ben Jacks, and the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. In the first half-hour segment, we discussed my dad's childhood growing up in Annapolis, Maryland as a transplanted Twins fan, and he discussed his favorite era of the game, his all-time lineup, and favorite manager. He talked a lot about the Twins in the 60s and early 70s. And then right before we went to break here, we jumped into the 2 greatest Twins teams of all time, the World Championship teams of 1987 and 1991. And we left off with you talking about Jack Morris signing his free agency deal in Toronto and free agency kind of changing the course of the game. And I kind of want to jump into a part of the game that I think is, for you, maybe the turning point of your interest in baseball and how it was a struggle to come back to being more of a fan in more recent years. And that's the 94 strike. I know I didn't write a question down about this, but I'd like to get your opinion or just your thought process of how your fandom in general changed because of the play stoppage in 1994, which resulted in a cancellation of the World Series.
Well, I'd have to first go back to the 81 strike because, it's just interesting. The way I reacted to that one was so different than 94 because when you're, 24 years old, you're not thinking on the level that you are when you're 38. So the 81 strike, I was annoyed the fact that it took 2 months, but it did finish, and we did have a World Series. I don't think the strike in 94 bothered me initially until they made the announcement that the season was canceled. I always believed throughout the strike, maybe naively so, but in 94 I always believed during the strike that there would be a settlement. And I had just finished my first year of teaching, and at that point I was not a union. I mean, I was in a teachers union, but I didn't really feel the importance of it. And so the guy that was head of the baseball union, and now his name escapes me, sort of a heavy-set...
Oh, the Major League Baseball Players Union?
Yeah.
Donald Fehr?
Donald Fehr.
Jerry Reinsdorf's good friend, Don Fehr.
I hated Donald Fehr. I thought he was...
Yeah, sure.
He was a complete asshole.
Yeah.
I couldn't stand him. He was smug. He was arrogant.
I was going to say.
I just, I didn't get him. I didn't get the strike. I didn't get the players. On the other hand, I wasn't sympathetic to the owners. And then I guess I basically decided when they announced the season was over that I just hated baseball, period. I just felt like, I kind of overall blamed it on the commissioner, Bud Selig, Magoo. I felt like...
I don't mean to interrupt. Where did that Magoo nickname
I
came
think
from?
it came from Jay Mariotti of the Sun-Times. He's the only person I remember that called him Magoo.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would say it probably took me 10 years to get over that strike. Especially the White Sox, I believe they're on their way to winning a world title that year, and that's obviously the team we were watching, and at that point the Cubs were pretty bad, and Frank Thomas was on his way to hitting 60 home runs, and it just felt like something was ripped away.
Tony Gwynn was really close to hitting 400 that year, too. He hit 394.
Yeah, I just, now that I've been teaching for almost 25 years and I've been involved in a strike myself, I see how important the union is. But it took about 10 years, I think, for me to, and I'll give baseball credit, they put a system in place now where it's more likely that that kind of situation will not happen again. But yes, it definitely was very painful to experience that.
So you referenced about 10 years or so. Is there a specific moment that sticks out with you that made you say, okay, it's time to, I'm not going to say completely get over that strike, because that was a really tough thing to do, to cancel the World Series, especially when, the Sox were in first place. I know you're not a big White Sox fan, but that team was very entertaining to watch. That was a tough pill to swallow. Was there, like I said, a one particular moment, or was it just an over a period of time sort of thing?
Well, as corrupt as it was, I got to say the home run chase with Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa and then Barry Bonds, I think that was when I started to see baseball as getting out of the political labor issue headlines. And then what finally got me more involved was probably 2003 when the Cubs, the Bartman series, when they played the Marlins. I think by 2003 I was on my way to finally seeing it more as a game, but then learning to accept that it's also always going to be a business. But yeah, I would say around home run chase, and in particular the 2003 season for the Cubs, that was really exciting. Even though they lost, I think that got me back on the path of, like I say, maybe maturing as a fan and realizing that it is a business, but it can also be a game.
So now here we are in 2016, and you mentioned Sammy Sosa and you mentioned the 2003 team. So I think you kind of know where I'm going with this. If you could, just for the listeners and for me, describe how you transitioned and why you transitioned from being a Twins fan to a Cubs fan. Obviously, we've been living in the Chicago area since I was a couple months old, since late 87. So you've been down here for a while, and if you could just talk to us about how you became a Cubs fan over time.
Well, believe it or not, when we moved to Vernon Hills in '89, I was just a pure Chicago baseball fan. I went to games at Wrigley. I went to games at Comiskey Park. And I think what happened was, first of all, in '89, the Cubs had a really good season. Obviously, they didn't make it to the World Series, but they got to the National League Championship. And I want to say my first game was a night game that year, '89, against the Mets. And Darryl Strawberry hit the longest home run I've ever seen in my life down the right field line, out of the stadium. And so that got me really excited. But I also enjoyed the White Sox in those days. Comiskey was a dump, but it was a fun place. And I really enjoyed it. It was relaxing. It was fun. 91, the first year they moved into the cell, I assumed it was like any other experience. And I remember telling my wife that I'm going to drive down there, I'm going to watch the Twins. And to me, it was just another night. And I didn't have a ticket, but I just was going to drive down. And I just always remember this really officious guy, kind of rude, stopped me right before I got to the parking lot. I said, if you don't have a ticket, you're not coming in here. And at that point, that just really turned me off. I was really pissed off. I don't know if he said you're not coming, but he said something like the fact you can't come in unless you have a ticket. And, I looked around and I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's no place to park. I'm not going to park on the south side. There's nowhere to park. And this guy is telling me point blank, you can't come in here. And I think that's when I started to turn against the White Sox. Not against the players, of course, or the managers, but the way they ran that facility. It was cold, it was sterile, and I think they, over the last 10 years, 11, 12 years, have finally started to understand that they did a lot of damage to the quote-unquote casual fan. Not like my son or my wife, the casual fan. Turned them off, and that's really the genesis of why I became more of a Cubs fan, because they've always been incredibly friendly. Like I said, the White Sox have made a lot of progress. But I think they got off to a bad start with me with the new facility, the way they treated people in the parking lot, and the security staff, and that's pretty much where it comes down to.
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, the parking attendants are still douchebags there, but it's neither here nor there. I do know that
Getting better.
it's getting better. It certainly is, but it just seemed like for a while there, when we go to games when I was a kid, it seemed like you always had issues with that, and I don't think that was solely just you. I think that was a universal problem at the Cell. I know that for years there have been issues with those sort of things. I know that people complain about the safety around the ballpark. I thought, and you're shaking your head right now, we can both agree that's quite the false narrative. But, yeah, I would say as a Sox fan, and we've discussed this with the team playing really poorly in the last month, the questions now are not about Ventura as a manager or Rick Hahn or Kenny Williams. I think people are going to start to point the finger at Jerry Reinsdorf like they already are with our basketball team in town here, because he owns both teams. And I think that's going to be an issue moving forward, that at some point he's going to either need to address by selling the team or changing things up in general with his front offices, because especially with the White Sox, they can't continue to – would you agree with this? They can't continue to fall behind too much of the Cubs in terms of revenue, on the field success, and all those factors. Would you say that's going to be something that he's going to have to address?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that go into it. Mike Ingram of Daily Herald wrote an interesting column about a week ago and said essentially the White Sox can never be the Cubs because their profit margin is so narrow because of the poor attendance, and that they're
smaller fan base in general.
They're like, for example, the James Shields deal, where they basically would only buy his contract if San Diego agreed to pay part of it, whereas the White Sox, or the Cubs, can just go and flat out buy all of Lester's contract and
Lester's a free agent.
But in other words, they can outbid. Yeah, they can outbid teams, right? Yeah. Having said that, though, I do think the White Sox. I disagree with Frank Thomas, who said that they have torn it down. It's a hard call to make. I don't really know. I know that I'm no baseball expert. I do think for years, as I said before, there is a public relations problem that goes back to when the facility was built. Reinsdorf, against all of his resistance, finally fixed the upper deck so the incline wouldn't be steep. They've tried, but I think there is a lot of things that has to be done, and maybe an admission on the fact that another thing that's a very sensitive subject, but it's just reality. If you notice the Cubs' frontline guys they've brought in, like the Rizzos and the Bryants, okay, that really, to me, has nothing to do with race. It has to do with the fact that, you got to be able to speak the language. And I think the White Sox, when you bring in every year after year, guys from Cuba, there's always this issue of, can you communicate with your fan base in the city? And I think the White Sox have always been kind of oblivious to all these concerns. They're strictly about baseball. Well, I mean, it's more than that. To grow your fan base, that's how you succeed. And I don't think there's been a commitment to that. I think they've said the only thing that matters is winning. But that's really a false argument, because if you grow your fan base, more people come, you'll have more revenue, and then you can go out and sign players. But, I met Reinsdorf once. He couldn't have been nicer when he was with the Bulls and my nephew Craig Hodges playing. So I'm sure he's a decent guy. but there is a lot of stuff there that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a conversation that we have frequently, and it's something that we could go on for days about. But I know you've said this before, Reinsdorf, really nice guy. It just seems like he's got a number of flawed business practices that are holding both of his organizations back. And only time will tell as to whether or not he's going to be willing and capable of resolving them. So to get into something more positive, we're going to go to we're going to start talking about the best team in baseball, Chicago Cubs. I just want to get your opinion of the team now, who your favorite player is. It might not be on the Cubs, but just your favorite player in the game.
Best
and
the NBA has ever been, professional football. These players today in baseball are so athletic. They have the fundamentals, which seem like they've come back over the last 5 to 10 years. There's a lot more teaching going on. In particular about the Cubs. I mean, obviously I like all the players, but I think what I like about it's kind of, again, answered in a different way. My favorite person in the Cubs organization is Theo Epstein, because he has brought in a mentality where if you don't have the right character, and I'm not necessarily talking about what you do at 3 o'clock in the morning, if you don't put your team ahead of everything when you walk into that ballpark, and you're not totally committed to the team, you're not going to play. And I think what I like about him is that he insists on passing that message down to the minor league system, all the way down to Class A. Every player that the Cubs that they bring up to the big club, has a team-first mentality. And even when the Twins were winning championships like 91, Morris wasn't like that. From what I can tell, he was kind of a douchebag, but he was a great pitcher. But I guess if I had to pick a player, wow, that's a hard call. I guess I would say Dexter Fowler, because I think he's brought so much energy to that team. He's just a fun guy. I like all the players, but I'm going to say 2. I like Fowler and I like David Ross. Ross has done more for the pitching staff and Montero, but I like their catchers, and I like Fowler.
Yeah, Dad, Dexter Fowler, I think he would have looked really good in a Chicago White Sox uniform. It's too bad that we couldn't sign him. I know that it was basically both sides of town and the Baltimore Orioles that were in on him at the end of the offseason, and he kind of surprised everybody by taking what was seen as somewhat of a pay cut to stay on the north side, but it was obviously a great decision for him, because he's returning to a World Series contending ball club, and you see it now with his 300-plus batting average. And the thing that I think is a little underrated about Fowler, but I'm sure you've picked this up, is that his defense this year, even compared to last year, has really improved. Have you noticed that as well?
Well, what I heard on TV, or maybe it was on radio, is that he's playing deeper this year.
Yeah.
And then some of the defensive improvement I would attribute to Jason Hayward, because Hayward is a stud. I mean, he is a true Gold Glove right fielder who can really go get it. And I think that takes a lot of pressure off of Fowler. He doesn't have to cover as much room as he did last year. Hayward, I was a little reluctant to embrace him at the beginning because of his hitting, but his defense is so good that that's what wins championships. And that's the other thing about the Cubs. I watched them yesterday. I went to the game, and Almora, all these guys can catch. There's not a single guy out there. Even Brian has gotten better. The only thing I think that I really question is their bullpen, which is why today I would still say they would struggle to win the World Series, because I'm not settled. I'm not comfortable with their bullpen. But everything else is A+.
And then if you had to say right now, in my opinion, I still think the Cubs are the favorite to win the National League pennant. But if you had to say right now, if you could choose one team that you think is the biggest challenger in the Cubs' path to just getting to the World Series, because I don't like talking about winning a World Series in June. I think that's just it's just hard to foresee that long-term step this early in the season. But who do you think would give the Cubs the most trouble in October in the National League playoffs right now?
Well, I've seen him play earlier in May in person, and just based on the game the other day, I really think the Nationals are a really tough matchup because Harper can win a game with one bat. Strasburg is a monster. I mean, this guy's got this calves the size of Godzilla. He throws easily in the mid to upper 90s. They got Zimmerman. In Dusty, we trusty. I mean, he's a perfect manager for this team. I think he would flame out in 3 years, but for right now, I think that is a really tough team to match up with.
Yeah, Max Scherzer, another great pitcher that they have. They're just a really fundamentally sound team. And I think, right now I would agree with you, Dad. I think the Nationals are slightly a peg above the Giants and Mets in terms of the teams that would give the Cubs the most trouble. That being said, I still think the Cubs, like I said, are definitely the favorites to win the National League pennant. Well, Dad, that concludes our interview, man. I really appreciate you coming on. I know that we went a little bit overboard on the time, but I wanted to get all the questions in, and you definitely provided me with some great answers. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you and Mom and my Uncle Brad enjoy the game on Monday night at Chavez Ravine. You guys are going out to L.A. Should be a fun trip out to Southern California. And once again, Dad, thank you very much for stopping by the podcast.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back with the conclusion of this episode with me wrapping up some thoughts on the Memorial Day podcast.
Are you looking for a great way to promote your business? Is your beer league softball team looking for more recognition? Do you need airtime to destroy your political rivals? Then contact the Ben Jacks Podcast, and this space could be yours for a fraction of the price of those greedy corporate podcasts.
And welcome back to the final segment of this weekend's episode of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks. Saturday night, June 18th, 2016. First off, I'd like to thank my father, Brian Jacks, for coming on this evening to discuss baseball. Dad, it was a pleasure to have you on tonight's episode. I knew that you were going to want to discuss some of the memories that you had from growing up being a Twins fan in the 60s when baseball was still your favorite sport, and also talking to you about the 87 and 91 Twins, going over your all-time lineup, and being a Cubs fan currently. I appreciate the number of different perspectives that you're able to provide to our listeners this evening. So once again, Dad, thank you very much for imparting your wisdom and sharing some of your baseball fan experiences with our listeners. It's greatly appreciated, and you're welcome to come back on anytime. And I know that you also, after we got off the air, discussed wanting to maybe start a football or basketball related podcast, something more just general sports related. So I'd love to maybe get something going during those seasons to discuss that further and get even more listeners on board. So once again, Dad, thank you very much, and hope to have you on the podcast soon once again. I'd like to close this evening with discussing a few comments that I made in the Memorial Day Twin Cities podcast with my fraternity brothers and my buddy Chris Salverson and our executive producer Kevin McGrath. I knew I was going to ruffle some feathers once I got into my critique of Cubs fans. I was well aware that was going to happen, and I do not regret saying what I said. However, I do regret if this was taken as a blanket statement towards all Cubs fans. That was certainly not intended to be the case. I also received some comments that my opinion of Cubs fans, the way I voiced it, I came across as being a bitter and sour grapes frustrated White Sox fan. In response to that, that's absolutely the truth. At this point in time, I am like any other Sox fan. I'm super frustrated. I think what adds to that is the overwhelming feeling that Sox fans get when they see the Cubs doing well, because Chicago is a Cubs town. I don't know what the split would be between Cubs and Sox fans percentage-wise. I think it's been estimated in previous years at 70-30 or 65-35, somewhere around that. So obviously at least 2/3 of the town feels like it's a Cubs fan base. So obviously when the Cubs are doing well and the Sox aren't doing well, it does, being a minority in that regard does, feel pretty overwhelming. But for me, it's been a frustrating season since about May 1st when the Sox took this nosedive that they're currently in. Now in 4th place here on June 18th, about 4.5 games back. It's been extremely frustrating to watch this team crumble right before our eyes, and to see the front office not really making the moves that would probably be conducive to setting this team up for being successful in the future, other than what I think was a pretty good draft. That's pretty much been the only bright spot for the organization in recent weeks. So, and the call-up of Tim Anderson. Other than that, when you get outside of TA and the amateur draft, it hasn't been fun. And it hasn't been fun for a while. They haven't been in the playoffs since 2008. And if the Mariners make the playoffs this year and the White Sox don't, they will have the longest playoff drought in the American League. That is as dubious an honor as it gets. It's certainly it just has not been enjoyable to watch White Sox baseball for almost a decade now. And the organization, as my father touched on, has been it has had its issues with public relations because of Jerry Reinsdorf being the owner and him not being as well versed in media and fan relations as an owner of 30-plus years should be. So I think as we approach the halfway point of the season and as the White Sox come to a crossroads here with what they're going to do, whether they're going to try to go for it and be competitive in a playoff race or whether they should start to trade off some parts and build towards the future, they are certainly approaching a crossroads as a front office. So I think at this point, in order to ease the frustration of me as a Sox fan and other Sox fans out there, they're going to have to make a strong decision one way or another as to what they want to do. They can't continue to pussyfoot around with their payroll and with prospects. They need to make one decision or another, because as a White Sox fan, it's getting pretty unbearable to watch the Sox big league team continue to struggle with not a whole lot on the horizon from the farm system. And then you look at the other side of town and you see a team in first place with a number of players who are either approaching their prime or in their prime, and they have a number of young guys in their system on the way to the north side to contribute at the big league level. It has become a night and day situation, and it's a nightmare scenario for White Sox fans, as it seems like nothing is going right now for the Sox, and everything is going right for the Cubs. So, long story short, yes, I am frustrated. Yes, I am bitter. Yes, I am jealous. And no, I don't care how any of that sounds, because it's the truth. And in order for that to change, the organization's going to have to make some really serious strides towards improving the overall farm system and the big league club, or else it's going to be more misery on the south side as is, regardless of what happens on the north side. So, long-winded, but yes, I don't apologize for what I said, and I hope that explanation is clear enough as to how frustrated and bitter and pissed off I am about how things have totally gone to hell for the White Sox in the last month and a half. Well, I'd like to thank once again my father, Brian Jacks, for coming on for this Father's Day weekend special. And now you can catch us on iTunes or Google Music Play by searching Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. Or if you're friends with me on Facebook, you can see me post the current podcasts as they are uploaded to iTunes as well. So you can catch us on Facebook, Google Play Music, or iTunes. And we will be back next weekend with a new episode discussing, at that point, it'll pretty much be the halfway point in the season calendar-wise, and about we're starting to get close to that 81-game mark, although we won't quite be there by the end of June. But we'll discuss a number of topics, including the MLB draft that took place earlier this month, as well as the College World Series. We'll take a look at where teams are in the standings, and we'll try to get to discussions on pitching around the big leagues, the issues with offenses and how power pitching is affecting the game in that regard, pitching injuries as well. And we're also going to discuss professional baseball contracts and the financial situation of the game and how it relates to other sports, as Major League Baseball is the only major sport in the United States that has no salary cap. So we'll discuss, compare and contrast Major League Baseball with the other leagues in terms of financial structure. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody who's been involved in the podcast up to date. I'd like to thank my executive producer, Kevin McGrath, for his outstanding work thus far. Look forward to working with you moving forward, buddy. Continue to do what you do with the production. Once again, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all the listeners who have been loyal to us over the first couple months of the big league season. We look forward to giving you more episodes coming up here in the coming weeks. And if you have any suggestions as to what you'd like to have me discuss, or who would you like to have me bring on the show, please submit any questions or suggestions onto my Facebook page, and I'll certainly try to answer it the best I can. Or if you have my phone number, go ahead and text me. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening to this weekend's Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. We'll be back next week, and until then, enjoy your Father's Day weekend, and we will see you or have you listen to us next Saturday. Thank you very much, and good night.